Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another iPhone dispatch, this time from a hotel room in South Carolina. I'm down here, a little work, a little visiting family. But yeah, I hopped off the plane yesterday at CHS, not at LAX, with a video in my heart, a video weighing on my soul. I also have all my notes here, so if you see me looking over, that's what I'm doing. But basically, based on some messages and comments we've gotten at TFD, based on my own sort of panicked and very anxious thought patterns about our economy, based on the news in the world right now, I wanted to specifically talk about the question that I think is on a lot of our minds, which is, are we heading into a recession? Are we already in a recession? What does that mean? And so forth. And I do want to say that if you have been rather paranoid and anxious yourself, especially over the past few weeks, specifically as it pertains to the market, your retirement, all of those things. Not that there's not a million other fucking bad things going on in the world at any given time. That's totally normal. I personally was on an hour-long call with my financial advisor yesterday, just basically shaking him by the shoulders via Zoom and being like, what the fuck is going on? Because if you haven't seen, the market, and specifically the US equities market, has taken a beating over the past few weeks. And I think there are a lot of reasons for this. A primary one being the constant, unpredictable, seemingly never really enforced in sincerity threats of tariffs to not just many trade partners, but our closest and most important allies. Obviously there's been even threats to Canada's sovereignty on top of these ridiculous tariff threats. We're talking about annexing Greenland. We're alienating pretty much the entire continent of Europe. Things are bad, to say the least. The vibes, as I've been saying, are quite off. And also, I think from both an economic and a diplomatic perspective, the fact that these tariff threats are so chaotic and unpredictable and seem to be put forth and then walked back on an almost minute-to-minute basis, I think is actually just as bad, if not worse, as the actual threats themselves. So suffice to say, the markets are not responding well to this, and we've seen just market dip after market dip that feel ominous and reminiscent of previous, let's just say, cyclical economic phenomena in the past that have not ended well. Now, I want to say a lot of things about this, hence the notes, but I want to start off by saying there is one silver lining, perhaps, in just the massive tumble that stocks have been taking, and that is the Tesla stock in particular. That was also one of the subjects I covered on my call with my financial advisor yesterday of at what point is the board going to step in and tell our favorite ketamine-addled South African that it's time to get the fuck back to work and stop these shenanigans? I don't know if it will be tomorrow. I don't know if it will be this summer. I don't know if it will be this year. But our president basically turning the White House lawn into a used car dealership, I don't think bodes well for Tesla. Also, as a total digression, the fact that Elon Musk has gone so far out of his way to alienate the customer base who are actually the only people willing to buy EVs, which is to say, generally speaking, liberals, is hilarious to me. Republicans will absolutely cheer you on X when you own the libs. They are not going to buy electric vehicles. They report that themselves in surveys. You can also see it in the purchasing data. Conservatives aren't going to buy your shitty EVs. Also, China is just going to completely own that market. They already basically do, but we're, accelerating that quite rapidly with the precipitous decline of Tesla sales. Is that a silver lining compared to what's happening to our country and the world? Probably not, but it does bring me great pleasure to think of Elon Musk suffering in any regard. So I'm going to take that one as a win. Shout out to his 14 children. Anyway, the question on everyone's mind, are we heading into a recession? Okay, I want to say this. Nobody in the world can predict with total accuracy what is going to happen to the market. We've talked about this a million times on TFE. Not financial advisors, not Warren Buffett, not the president. No one can predict it. You can make educated guesses. You can also sometimes access privileged information and do a little insider trading. Famously, one of the few crimes that will send rich white people to prison. But generally speaking, no one really ever knows what's going to happen to the market. So it would be dishonest for me to sit here and say, yes, this is what's going to happen. If I had to guess, based on all available information, based on my own planning, how I'm thinking of things, I do believe that a recession is to some degree imminent. And in that, I want to give you sort of the good and bad, or at least the mildly reassuring and the terrifying, because I do think that there's often, when it comes to economic and political news, not enough of a balance there. We're either just scaring the shit out of each other for views and engagement, or we're huffing copium, as the kids say, and not engaging with reality. So the good-ish news about a recession is that these things are generally cyclical. We can look back at over 150 years of market trends and see that recessions come in all forms. They come generally on a fairly predictable schedule. This would be a little early based on the usual recession cycles. We really never know what's going to cause economic upheaval generally, or it's rare that you can see the picture in full. I mean, obviously in 2008, we had the subprime mortgage crisis, which clearly some people were aware of that and making huge money off of it. And I'm not going to go into my digression on Wall Street and how much we let them off the hook for essentially causing that. But then in 2020, you had COVID. That's not really something that the economic markets would have sort of built into their analysis. So you never really know what it's going to be. But we do know and have enough historical data to see that not only do recessions happen on a fairly cyclical basis, but they also play an important part in sort of the overall growth and performance of the market. Now, we can go on a huge digression, start singing the Internationale and saying our retirement should not be tied up with the stock market. I agree. I think we should have pensions. I think we should have a much more robust Social Security. I think that people should be guaranteed a dignified retirement whether or not they are invested in the market. That being said, the vast majority of Americans still depend on the performance of the stock market in order to shore up their retirements. So when you see these dips, it's very scary. It is, however, important to understand that from an investing strategy perspective, these dips in the markets are also very important for being able to get invested and invest more heavily. Now, that does sort of presuppose that you are going to be able to wait out even really big dips in the market, which, for example, if you're one of the many people being forced into early retirement through a government job, this is now likely to be one of the worst times that you could have to tap into your 401k because the market looks like it's going to not be living its best life for a while, let's say. But all of that is to say this is somewhat cyclical. So the fact that there would be some kind of a recession, I think, is not necessarily. I think we just have to, as we look at sort of a lifetime's worth of economic planning and understanding, we just have to kind of accept that this is part of the market reality. That being said, and I think this is the doomer news, is that what is happening now is not only, I think in many ways, much more bad and wide-reaching than just a dip in the markets. It is, in my opinion, a geopolitical crisis of completely our own design and making, not something that was at all forced upon us, something that we're actively going into because, like it or not, this Trump won the election, so. At least 33% of the country, a plurality of the country was in support of this, and he's doing it. He's keeping those promises. He's making shit really bad at I would say, record warp speed. So the fact that what is likely to be, at least in some ways, causing this particular market dip are these essentially geopolitical crises, often with our closest allies, that are totally unforced. I think that's a lot worse than your standard issue recession, and I think has many more wide-reaching consequences, and is also just indicative of a very, very scary era in American social and political life. I should also say that as it pertains to tariffs, Trump has been well documented for a long time as being obsessed with tariffs for reasons that are very baffling to me, baffling to economists. But this is something he was going on about well before his brain was eaten by the McDonald's worms. Now, though, I think he's at a point where we're not really listening to reason, and this is his fixation, his special interest, some might say, and we'll see how far he's going to ride this one out. Right now, it seems like he's just having a great time waking up every morning, threatening destabilizing tariffs to all of our closest allies, and then calling it off by the evening. And so if the answer is yes, we are likely heading into a recession, the question becomes, well, what do we do? So we have done ample content on how to prepare financially and professionally for a recession. It's not rocket science. It basically is earn more, spend less, make sure that your resume and your sort of professional viability is as up to date as possible. It's essentially do all of the things that we tell you to do on a day-to-day basis more or better. We'll link you in the description to some of our greatest hits on just sort of financially shoring yourself up. We also have resources down below for products that we endorse if you're looking to do things like invest or whatever. I will say, if we do enter a recession, now's a good time to be buying into the market. So again, that's always the silver lining of a recession. But generally speaking, how to prepare for a recession is just engage in financial literacy a little bit more than you were already doing. Be better, smarter with your money. And again, we'll link you to more detailed resources, but I think that there is often a fallacy that there is some, crazy other strategy you need to be clicking into in order to prepare for a recession. That's not really how it works. Generally speaking, if you are being thoughtful with money on an ongoing basis, you're already doing pretty much what you're supposed to be doing. And it's also not normal for people to have to essentially build, economic bunkers for themselves once every, 7 to 10 years to prepare for some horrific economic fallout. So I say all of that to say, yes, if I had to guess, we're probably headed into a recession. Does that mean you should radically change your financial or professional strategy? If you were already following generally good financial advice, probably not. I actually think, though, that at this very moment, and kind of as it pertains to economic volatility generally, almost the more important thing to do is to learn how to deal with this on an emotional and psychological level, because often these moments will create a panic in us and an anxiety in us that leads us to make the worst possible decisions, whether that's, pulling our money out of the market at a terrible moment because we're terrified of seeing the number go down, something that is very, very common and literally the worst decision you can make financially if you're invested in the market, to just, spending every night in a completely unproductive doom scrolling cycle, which is something that I think we've all engaged in at least a few times since, last November. And I'm certainly not immune to. Now, me, obviously, I will get on the horn with that financial advisor and be like, tell me something that will help me sleep tonight. And they can only give you so much information, and, they're not soothsayers either, but it does provide, an extra pair of adult eyes in the room to help slow things down. But even just generally how we navigate these things, one of the questions that has come up over and over is Trump trying to cause a recession? And the argument for that is, okay, well, it's a really good way to further coalesce and condense wealth at the hands of the very wealthiest, because when recessions happen, a lot of, businesses go bankrupt, a lot of people lose property. Essentially everyone in the bottom half, if not even more than that, loses big. And then the few people who have enough liquid capital to scoop everything up, then, further enrich themselves and further entrench how much of sort of the owning/capital class belongs to them. That's kind of how it always plays out historically in recessions. It makes sense, right? If you have money, recessions are pretty good for you. Is that what he's trying to cause to further enrich his billionaire buddies and himself? If I had to make an educated guess, I would say probably not, because I think that the way he's going about it is very alienating to a lot of the most important business interests in this country. I mean, for example, I think, one of the big factors in him backing off the tariffs initially was, the car companies coming to him and being like, Bud, what the fuck are you doing? We can't even plan for next year. We can't market. We can't do our budgets because we literally don't know where our products are coming from, how much they're going to cost, et cetera, how much we're going to charge. So I think the knock-on effects of the way he's approaching this sort of recession strategy, if you want to call it that, is I think it's a little bit at cross purposes with just purely wanting to enrich the richest people in the country. I think there would be better ways to do that, notably tax cuts. And we are obviously seeing in the proposed budget now in Congress, the tax cuts we saw in the last Trump presidency, we're just saying, hit me again with the same. Let's run that one back, chief. So obviously there's a huge interest in further taxing, alienating, and crushing the working and middle classes and further benefiting the wealthiest among us, again, in large part through things like tax cuts and other economic policies. I don't know that this utterly chaotic and diplomatically deranged tariff gambit is really the way to go about causing a recession if it's just in the name of further enriching the wealthiest among us. So my guess would be probably not, but I also think that this line of thinking, is Trump trying to cause a recession, is sort of pointless to even, like, we'll never know, right? You can never know for certain. And as we've seen, like, even when it comes to actual crimes that this man has been convicted of, none of it matters. Like, it doesn't have consequences. And I think, especially with the Supreme Court ruling vis-a-vis, a president's powers and immunity, like, whether or not he's doing things for the right or wrong reasons kind of ceases to matter. And in the case of what he's doing economically, like, all of the reasons he could have are bad ones. And so I think that line of thinking causes us a layer of anxiety and stress and, and sort of panic that is completely unnecessary, and also, again, kind of a distraction from what is actually happening and how we deal with it politically. There's also, I think, in a similar feeling of, like, is he doing this on purpose? There's also that question of, like, are the adults, aka like the Fortune 50 CEOs and, whoever else, going to step in at some point, the Treasury, the Fed, whoever, like, are the adults going to come into the room and be like, knock it off, buddy? I think they already have to some extent. I think there are definitely early signs of that, but I think also the appetite for short-term economic chaos, for long-term wealth aggregation and economic dominance is probably higher than a lot of us would like to think. I think there's just generally, especially on the right, where the goal ultimately is the dissolution of a lot of these programs, a lot of these subsidies that go to the working and middle classes, which are, again, a fraction of the subsidies that go to the wealthiest. Like, in the long-term interest of reshaping American political economic life in their image, there's quite the appetite for chaos in the short term. So will the adults step in? Maybe, probably. They already sort of are to an extent, but I don't think nearly as much or as soon as any of us would like them to. And also, in a lot of ways, like, they're not the adults. And this is where I want to also kind of push back. I made a TikTok about this the other day, but, like, as of even today, as of recording this, like, the Democratic response, I think, has been insanely insufficient for anyone who votes Democrat, anyone who considers themselves left of center, or even just doesn't want what's happening to happen. Like, there's been very little to no response on the part of the Democrats. And I think it's very important for us to all kind of understand that the majority of Democrats in power are much further right economically than the average Democrat voter. Like, we've established that time and time again. Like, these are economic centrists at best. So as it pertains to, for example, like, right-wing economic policy, for the most part, a lot of these elected officials lean much closer to a Donald Trump than even a Bernie Sanders. Like, they would probably prefer a Trump presidency to a Sanders presidency, because ultimately they're not looking to reshape our economic policy in a way that actually favors, the working and middle classes. Is it better than what we currently have? Yes. But I think that we've seen time and time again, and this has also been seen globally, that, a very tepid centrism that stands for essentially nothing is not a long-term sustainable opposition to far-right nationalism. And again, they pretend to be economically populist. They're not really, they're essentially neocons economically, if not worse. But they present a more compelling narrative, because at least they're throwing, again, in my opinion, completely odious and bigoted red meat to their base, but they're throwing something. Centrist Democrats for decades now offer almost literally nothing to their bases, again, especially from an economic perspective. And so waiting for, these centrist Dem senators, or waiting for, CEOs of car and plane and oil companies to come save us, to come be the adults in the room and restore order, I think is also a very naive way of looking at it, and not how these things work. As we said in our most recent video essay, like, for the most part, the owning class is always going to side with and sort of activate for the owning class. And it's kind of irrespective of left or right. It's about up or down. So if you are someone who is reading the news and is constantly thinking, are we heading into a recession? Like, I think the most important thing to do is step back and say some speculation is probably good, because it allows us to plan more thoughtfully and intentionally for what could possibly happen. But over speculating just causes this sort of paralysis of our judgment and our critical thinking and doesn't allow us to focus on what is actually in front of us. Will we ever truly know the motivations of a Trump or a Musk or a whoever? Probably not. Does it matter? Also probably not. What matters is the actual tangible material outcomes. And we have to decide where we are politically. You know, in that video that I made about Democrats being ineffectual, I ended it by saying, like, a lot of this will not change until at every level of government, we are going after, you know, in these primaries, going after the Democrats who are not putting up enough of a fight, who are not representing an actual left economic agenda. And the response to that, I mean, there are a lot of people who agree, but there are also kind of two key differentiators. There were the people who are saying electoral politics is done and dead. Who cares? It's time to take to the streets. Which, by the way, I think you can walk and chew gum. I think you can do both. And the people who say, like, Democrats can't do anything, they don't have enough of a majority, who basically let Democrats off the hook for everything, the sort of blue no matter who, blue MAGA kind of crowd thinking. And I think both of these are very intellectually lazy and dishonest, to be fair. Because A, if you're someone who's saying that electoral politics is dead and worthless, like, show me what else you're doing, because it can't just be commenting on my TikToks, which I know is what a lot of people do. They love to feel morally superior, go on pages, talk about how it's a waste of time to even think about voting anymore, and we need a revolution. Okay, baby, you first. You go start. You go show me that revolution you're starting and we'll talk. I think for most of them, it's just a matter of being a keyboard warrior. But also, again, there's nothing to say that you can't be engaging in direct action of all kinds and also engaging in electoral politics. I think you can do both. I think many people do both. In fact, the most politically engaged people I know are also doing things like mutual aid. They're also protesting. They're also showing up, for various non-governmental action. They're also engaging in boycotts. Like, you can do both, let's be clear. And to the people who say, well, Dems don't have a majority, so they can't do anything, be very, very clear that if the situation were reversed, and it has been, Mitch McConnell would be all but chaining himself to a column on the Senate floor, essentially shutting down the government until he got his way. There's plenty they could be doing. There's plenty. They could all be doing what Bernie Sanders is doing and going to every Trump county in the Midwest to try and win them back. Let's be clear about that. But I actually don't think electoral politics are dead. And I say that because I live in the state of New York and I own a business in the state of New York. So I can tell you that, especially given the system that we have in America, which is extremely atomized, for better or for worse, each state is essentially like its own little country. And even on a city to city level, it varies hugely. I live in a city where my employees have 12 weeks of their mat leave subsidized by the state. I can get on a relatively high-speed train and go to any other metropolis on the Eastern Seaboard in a few hours. If I had a child, they would be entitled to free 3K, which is like a pretty revolutionary program. All of these things are policies, right? All of these things are a result of putting people into office who actually have your best interest at heart. And you can see every single day on basically every metric the radical differences in outcome based on the elected officials that you put in place. So I actually do believe that there are tons of reasons and actual benefits to being engaged politically, that we're not just at a point where we need to throw up our hands and say, okay, it's revolution or bust, baby. And again, even if that were the case, there's still shit happening in your city. There's still shit happening in your state. And in fact, strengthening our states and our cities and putting the best people in place in them is all the more important with what's going on in the federal government. I say all of this to say, are we headed into a recession? Maybe, probably. Should that really change what we're doing on a day-to-day basis? Not if we were already handling our money in a smart and thoughtful way. Is there anything that we can do to stop it in the short/immediate term? Probably not. In the long term, yeah, there's a lot we can do, but that totally depends on us not being burned out by these completely unproductive thought spirals and actually taking action, whether that be getting involved politically or socially or in your community or whatever that looks like to you. But we can already see, again, look at the pain that Elon Musk is under right now from actual grassroots responses to his company, which does represent the majority of his wealth. That's big. And that's in an extremely short time span. Is it enough? Does it outweigh everything else that's happened? No. But at the risk of being corny here, to be a citizen is to always be struggling for a better future. We're never going to be at a place where we can just say, well, we're at the end of history. This is as good as it's going to get. Now we just sit back and let it get better. That's not how it works. We always have to be active, engaged citizens working together to decide the kind of future and the kind of economy that we want to live in. My ideal economy does not make everyone rely on their 401k in order to retire in dignity. But until we're at that point, I also want to help you get the best retirement you possibly can within your means. as I said, we can walk and chew gum. We can also be in a recession and still make good choices. That's what I wanted to hop on here and say, as much for myself as for you guys. The struggle continues. See you next time.